The sun hung high over Dry Hollow, its heat unrelenting, as a lone rider crested the ridge. Dust clung to her faded coat, her boots worn for miles on unforgiving trails. Ellie Hayes didn't care about the town. She'd passed through dozens just like it. Dry, barren, and full of whispers. She had learned long ago to move fast, keep her head down, and never let anyone get too close. The town's single street stretched before her, cracked boards and crooked signs mocking the idea of prosperity. As she walked past the saloon, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You the one they call Ellie Hayes?" Ellie froze. She didn't turn around. "Yeah, I thought so. You're the one who burned that cabin near Salt Creek, ain't ya?" Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't answer. The truth didn't matter here. Not anymore. She wasn't here for redemption, just for water, maybe a bite to eat. And then she'd leave. But as she reached the door of the diner, something stopped her. A little voice, light but certain, called out, "Want to meet my daddy?" Before we begin, we'd love for you to watch the story closely and, by the end, rate out of 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us understand the kind of stories you enjoy, and it guides us in creating even better content for you. Ellie's hand paused on the diner's worn wooden door. The voice behind her came again, lighter this time, almost pleading. "Want to meet my daddy?" The words rattled around in her mind, conflicting with every instinct that told her to keep moving. She turned slowly, squinting against the midday sun. A little girl stood there, barefoot, clutching a rag doll. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes were wide and trusting. Ellie felt something stir, something she hadn't let herself feel in years. She had no reason to stay. The road was waiting, endless and cold, just like every town she had passed through. But the girl smiled up at her, a mischievous grin that caught Ellie off guard. "He's got horses. And pie," the girl added, her voice almost a whisper as if sharing a secret. Ellie hesitated, her heart pounding. Maybe this was just another detour in the story of her life. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. The sun beat down as Ellie climbed into the wagon, its wheels creaking under their weight. Leah, the little girl, sat beside her, humming a tune Ellie had never heard. The scent of pine mixed with the dust of the road, and Ellie gripped the side of the wagon, feeling the weariness of the miles already covered. The girl chattered endlessly, her voice light and carefree. "Daddy says horses are smart. They listen better than people." Ellie smiled faintly. It felt strange, this innocent conversation, as though the world had shifted and become simpler for a moment. The wagon rolled on through the scrubland, the town of Dry Hollow shrinking behind them. Ellie kept her eyes ahead, but a question gnawed at her. What kind of man was Leah's father? A part of her didn't want to know. The other part, the part that had been hardened by years of survival, couldn't help but wonder if this would be the first time in years someone looked at her and didn't see the past. The ranch emerged from the dust like a ghost, a low house, weathered and tucked against the hillside, with a sagging porch and ivy creeping along the posts. The air was cooler now, the ground beneath the wagon softer as they neared the place Leah had called home. Ellie felt a ripple of unease, but it was too late to turn back. Leah hopped off the wagon before it even came to a full stop, her bare feet slapping the dirt as she dashed toward the house. Ellie followed slower, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. As she stepped onto the porch, a man appeared in the doorway. His tall frame blocked the light, his face unreadable. His eyes were pale gray, piercing, and when they met Ellie's, she felt a weight settle between them. "You're Ellie Hayes," he said. Not a question, but a statement. She nodded. "I am." His gaze lingered for a moment too long before he stepped aside. "Come in. You'll need shelter for the storm tonight." Inside the ranch house, the warmth of the hearth met her like an old memory, familiar, but strange. The room was sparsely furnished, with a stone fireplace crackling softly in the corner. Ellie glanced around, noticing the quiet order of the space. Worn books on the mantel, a quilt draped across a rocking chair, and a picture of a woman that caught her attention. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man, Marshall, as she would later learn, glanced at the photograph. His expression softened just slightly. My wife. She passed 3 years ago. Ellie didn't respond, but the weight of his words settled heavily in the air. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any comfort. The silence stretched between them until Leia's voice broke through, light and full of innocence. Daddy, can she stay? Just a little while. Ellie looked at Marshall, unsure of the answer she was hoping for. Marshall's gaze lingered on her, then softened. For tonight. Then you'll need to move on. The evening passed quietly. Leia played outside with the dog, while Ellie and Marshall shared a simple meal in silence. The fire crackled softly in the background, and the scent of roasted meat filled the room. Ellie sat still, her thoughts racing. She had expected judgment, questions, anything but this strange calm. As the night deepened, Ellie wandered through the house, her eyes drawn to the worn bookshelves. One book caught her attention, tucked away in the back, its pages yellowed with age. She reached for it, flipping through the pages. A journal, its edges frayed, with neat cursive written inside. She read the first few entries, simple things at first, recipes, notes about Leia's first steps, sketches of the creek. But as she turned the pages, the entries grew darker. Her fingers froze as she reached the last entry, dated the day of June Carr's death. If I'm not back by sundown, tell Leia I sang to the trees. The words hit Ellie like a stone. She closed the journal slowly, feeling the weight of something unspoken between these walls. Ellie woke early, the light filtering through the cracked blinds and painting the floor with golden streaks. The house was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire still burning low on the hearth. She stood up, stretching stiff muscles, her eyes settling on the journal she had found the night before. Leia's laughter rang out from the yard, breaking the stillness. Ellie moved toward the door, but before she could step outside, Marshall appeared, blocking her path. His expression was unreadable, as usual, but there was something softer in his eyes this morning. Breakfast's ready, he said. Ellie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She followed him into the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. She could feel his gaze on her, but she refused to meet it. She couldn't let herself get too comfortable here. The storm was coming, and with it, the truth Ellie wasn't sure she was ready to face. The storm came in quickly, dark clouds rolling in over the horizon. Ellie watched from the window as the wind began to pick up, the first drops of rain splattering against the glass. Leia was inside, her small hands busy with a pile of wildflowers she had picked earlier. Marshall stepped outside to secure the barn doors, his broad figure barely visible in the distance. Ellie stayed inside, her thoughts tangled like the storm outside. She had spent the night thinking about the journal, about the woman in the photograph, and about the words that had haunted her since the moment she found them. Ellie glanced at the door, wondering if she should follow Marshall and ask him about June. She knew better than to push, but the questions in her mind wouldn't stop. The storm was a perfect metaphor for everything she couldn't control, everything she wasn't ready to face. By the time the rain turned to a steady downpour, the house was filled with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. Ellie sat by the hearth, trying to ignore the aching tension in her chest. Marshall had returned from the barn, dripping wet, his clothes sticking to his skin. He went straight to the kitchen, refilling his mug with coffee, but his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Ellie watched him, and for the first time, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of something unspoken. She couldn't hold back anymore. "Tell me about her," Ellie said quietly, her voice almost drowned out by the storm. Marshall looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He took a slow breath, then finally spoke. June was different. She didn't belong to this place, but she fought for it. For us. His words trailed off, and the silence stretched between them. Ellie couldn't help but feel that the answers she sought were just out of reach. Later that evening, Ellie found herself once again sitting in the quiet of the living room, the journal resting open in her lap. The pages were worn, the ink faint in places, but Ellie's eyes scanned each word carefully. Leia's small voice echoed from the other room, singing a lullaby as she played with the dog. But Ellie was absorbed in the journal's final entries, each one darker than the last. She stopped at the page where June had written about seeing a rider near the ridge, the same man who had been watching from the shadows. Ellie's fingers trembled as she turned the page. The last entry was the most chilling. June had written about a knock on the door. Too hard, too slow. Ellie closed the journal, her thoughts spinning. The pieces were starting to come together, but she still didn't understand the full picture. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside washed clean. But Ellie felt far from clear. As she worked beside Marshall, mending the fence near the barn, her mind raced with questions. What had really happened to June? Marshall was silent, his face set in a quiet concentration, but Ellie could sense his unease. Every glance he threw her way was like a silent conversation. He knew she was digging, but he didn't stop her. Not yet. By noon, they had finished with the fence, and Leah had returned from playing outside, her cheeks rosy from the cool air. Ellie stood, dusting her hands on her trousers, and finally turned to Marshall. "I found something," she said. "The letter June wrote." Marshall's face went pale. He met her gaze for a moment, then turned away. "You shouldn't have." Ellie's heart hammered in her chest. "Why?" Marshall didn't answer, but the truth was now just a breath away. Ellie sat on the porch that evening, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows across the ranch. The silence between her and Marshall felt heavier now. He hadn't spoken since she confronted him about June's letter, and she wasn't sure if he ever would. Leah played with a handful of pebbles, humming a tune that seemed to fill the emptiness. Ellie's fingers traced the worn edge of the journal, but her mind was focused on the man inside the house. Marshall's silence was a shield, but it was a fragile one. Ellie could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his past and the secrets he held. She didn't know what he was afraid of, but she was starting to suspect that the truth was far darker than she'd imagined. As dusk fell, Ellie stood and went inside. Marshall was at the stove, his back to her. She took a deep breath, deciding to speak the words that had been building up. Ellie's voice broke the stillness of the room. "You owe me the truth, Marshall. You owe her the truth." Marshall didn't look up. He continued stirring the pot, his movements slow, deliberate. But Ellie's words hung in the air, demanding to be heard. June was trying to protect something, wasn't she? Ellie pressed. She knew what was going on, what you were a part of. Marshall's grip tightened on the spoon. His jaw clenched, but he still didn't answer. Ellie's frustration grew. "I found the letter, Marshall." June knew about the land deals, about the corruption. She wasn't just protecting Leah. She was protecting everyone. Marshall finally turned, his face pale. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I didn't want any of this, but I couldn't stop it. And when June found out, I thought she was better off dead than living with that truth." Ellie's breath caught. This was more than betrayal. It was something darker. Marshall's words were like a sharp knife, cutting deep. Ellie didn't know how to respond. The storm of emotions inside her, anger, confusion, sympathy, fought for dominance, but she kept them in check. "How could you let her go on like that?" she whispered. "How could you live with that?" Marshall's face twisted in pain. "I never wanted to hurt her, but when the landowners came for me, I was trapped. I made a deal. They had their claws in everything, town politics, the land, the law. I couldn't get out. I thought I could save Leah from it." Ellie stepped closer, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "And June, what about her? Was she just a pawn in your game?" Marshall flinched, the guilt hitting him hard. He stared at the ground, unable to look her in the eye. The house seemed to close in on them, the weight of years of lies pushing down. Ellie's fists clenched at her sides. "You think I don't understand?" she asked, her voice rising. "You think I don't know what it's like to be trapped in a system that's out of your control?" Marshall's eyes widened, but Ellie didn't wait for him to speak. "I've lived that life. I've seen what people do when they're backed into a corner. But you didn't have to let her die, Marshall. You didn't have to let her die for your damn secrets." Tears blurred her vision, but she fought them back. The truth had finally begun to surface, but it felt like a wound that might never heal. Marshall stood motionless, his shoulders hunched, every inch of him weighed down by the guilt he had buried for so long. Ellie didn't know if she could forgive him. Maybe she didn't have to. But the truth, now that it was out, felt like a fire that couldn't be put out. The night stretched on, heavy with the silence of their unspoken thoughts. Ellie sat at the table, staring at the journal. Leah had long since gone to bed, her soft breathing the only sound in the house. Ellie's mind raced. She thought about the land, about the people who had taken it, about the ones who had silenced June. She thought about Marshall, a man torn between duty and guilt, trapped by his own choices. But Ellie wasn't one to let the past define her. Not anymore. She stood, wiping her eyes. She couldn't change what had happened to June, but she could make sure that her death wasn't in vain. Marshall was still in the other room, his back to her as he stared out the window. Ellie walked past him, determination in her step. "I'm going to make this right," she said, her voice low but firm. "I won't let her die for nothing." Marshall didn't turn around, but Ellie knew, deep down, that the reckoning had only just begun. Ellie barely slept that night. The weight of the secrets she had uncovered pressed on her chest, but she couldn't let it break her. The truth had to be brought to light. In the early hours, she stood at the window, watching the light of dawn filter through the trees. She needed a plan, one that would force the town to reckon with what had been buried for too long. She couldn't do it alone. Marshall remained a silent figure in the corner of the room, his eyes distant, lost in his own regrets. Ellie couldn't waste time waiting for him to act. She had to move fast. Her mind was set. She would return to Dry Hollow's town hall, find the records, the documents that proved everything. She would confront the town and make them answer for their part in June's death. This wasn't just about justice. It was about redemption, for her and for June. The day was clear, and the air had a bite to it, a reminder that the seasons were changing. Ellie saddled her horse and glanced back at the house. Marshall didn't meet her gaze as she mounted, and Leah stood in the doorway, her small face filled with questions. Ellie couldn't afford to explain now. There were bigger things at play. She kicked the horse into a steady trot, feeling the wind whip past her as she made her way toward Dry Hollow. The town felt like a distant memory, but the thought of confronting the people who had buried the truth made her heart pound. She'd been running from her past for too long. It was time to face it head-on. As she rode, the weight of the journal and June's final words hung heavy on her mind. The truth was out there, and Ellie was determined to bring it to the light. Dry Hollow looked different now. The once familiar streets felt colder, darker. Ellie rode straight to the town hall, the building looming in the distance. It had always felt like a place of hidden agendas, but today, she would make it a place of reckoning. She dismounted and tied her horse to the post, her hand steady, but her heart racing. The door creaked open as she entered, the smell of old paper and dust hitting her immediately. Inside, the dim light of the room matched the secrets buried within. Ellie walked past the clerk's desk, her eyes scanning the records stacked neatly in rows. She knew where to look, the legal files, the town-sealed documents. Ellie began her search, flipping through pages quickly, her fingers trembling. Her breath quickened when she found them. The land deeds, the signatures, and the connections. The evidence she needed was all right here. She had to expose it. Ellie returned to the ranch late that evening, her hands full of papers and her mind full of the truth. She barely noticed the nightfall as she approached the house, the weight of what she carried more pressing than the darkness. Marshall was waiting by the porch, his arms crossed, his face etched with concern. When he saw the papers in her hands, he flinched. "You found them," he said, his voice low. Ellie nodded, her gaze hardening. "It's all here. The land deals, the corruption, your name on the papers. June was right. You were part of it all." Marshall swallowed, his eyes flickering with regret. "I didn't want it to go this far, Ellie. I thought I could protect Leah, but I was wrong. I can't change what happened, but I can't let you expose this. They'll come after us." Ellie stepped closer, Her jaw set. I'm not asking for your permission. It's time for everyone to know the truth. The next morning, Ellie stood outside the ranch, watching the horizon. The storm clouds were gathering again, but this time, it wasn't the weather that made her uneasy. It was the future. She had made her decision. She would go back to Dry Hollow, face the people who had buried June's death, and confront the town for the corruption they'd let thrive. But she couldn't do it alone. Marshall came to stand beside her, his face set in determination. I'll help you, he said quietly. Ellie glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. You don't have to, Marshall. This is my fight. He shook his head. It's mine too. I can't change what I did, but I can make sure the truth gets out. I can't live with the lie any longer. Ellie looked back at the town, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. But she wasn't running anymore. She was staying, and she was fighting. The morning was still, the air heavy with the promise of a storm, but Ellie's focus was unshaken. She packed her bag with the legal papers she had found in Dry Hollow. Marshall stood quietly beside her, the weight of their decision sinking in. I'll take the lead when we get to town, Ellie said, her voice steady but firm. You stay behind me. Marshall nodded, but Ellie could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't want to go back to the people he once called friends, people who could easily turn on him. But Ellie knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about June, about Leah, and about the truth that had been buried far too long. Let's get this over with, Marshall said quietly. Ellie didn't answer. She swung her bag over her shoulder and walked toward the door. The storm outside could wait. They had a fight to win. As Ellie and Marshall rode toward Dry Hollow, the storm clouds gathered, darkening the sky. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground beneath them was slick with the remnants of rain. The town was just a few miles ahead, but each step felt heavier than the last. Ellie's heart raced as she thought of the confrontation ahead. She had to expose the truth, but she didn't know how the town would react. Would they listen, or would they turn their backs on her, just like they had to June? Marshall remained quiet beside her, his eyes locked on the road ahead, as if lost in his own thoughts. Ellie could feel the weight of the silence, but it didn't bother her. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. She would face whatever came next. The doors of the Dry Hollow Town Hall were already open when Ellie and Marshall arrived. A group of townsfolk had gathered, murmuring in hushed voices. Ellie's heart pounded as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. She took a deep breath and walked to the center of the room. The sheriff, Mayor Dion, and several others stood at the front, their faces hardened with suspicion. Ellie couldn't let fear take over now. This town has buried the truth for too long, she began, her voice steady but strong. I'm here to expose it. June Carr was murdered, and the people of this town are responsible for her death. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Ellie didn't stop. I have the evidence, documents, land deeds, and your names all over them. The room fell silent. Ellie's words hung heavy in the air. This was only the beginning. The mayor stepped forward, his face red with anger. You've gone too far, Ellie Hayes, he spat. You think we'll let you tear this town apart? You're nothing but trouble, a convict who doesn't belong here. Ellie stood her ground, meeting his eyes without flinching. I belong here more than any of you. I'm the one who's been wronged, and I'm not leaving until the truth comes out. The sheriff moved closer, his hand hovering over his holster. You need to leave now before we make you. Marshall stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Ellie's right. You've been lying to this town, and it's time for it to stop. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ellie didn't know if she could change the minds of everyone here, but she wasn't backing down. Ellie felt the eyes of the crowd on her, their judgment weighing her down like a stone. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation. They had all been part of the lie. But she had the evidence. She held the documents, the proof of the corruption, the land deals that had been manipulated. She wasn't going to let them cover it up anymore. One by one, the townsfolk began to murmur, voices rising in anger and confusion. How could you? One man asked, "How long did you think you could hide this?" Ellie took a deep breath, feeling the fire of her anger rise. The truth is out. There's no going back. It's time for all of you to answer for what you've done. The mayor's face twisted in fury, but Ellie wasn't afraid. She had nothing left to lose. The walls had come down, and now the truth would have to stand. Mayor Dion's face contorted with rage as he stepped forward. "You'll pay for this, Ellie Hayes. You think you can just waltz in here and ruin everything we've worked for?" Ellie stood her ground, not flinching at the threat in his voice. "You've been hiding behind lies for too long, Dion. You'll answer for it, just like the rest of them." Behind her, she could feel Marshall tense. His past was coming back to haunt him, but Ellie wouldn't let him face it alone. Not anymore. The sheriff stepped in, his hand still on his holster. "This is your last warning. Leave now or we'll make you." Ellie turned to Marshall. "You've already made your choice. Now it's time for mine." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, she saw Marshall's face soften. He stepped forward beside her. "We're not leaving, Sheriff. You're the ones who are going to have to answer." The tension in the room reached its peak. The crowd was split, some whispering among themselves, others glaring at Ellie and Marshall. The mayor's eyes were wild with anger, but Ellie could see the cracks in his facade. One by one, people began to speak up, their voices trembling with fear and guilt. "I knew something wasn't right," one woman confessed. "I saw the land deals. I didn't know what to do." Ellie's grip tightened on the papers. This was it, the moment when everything changed. "We were all complicit," another man said, his voice shaking. "I should have said something sooner, but I was scared." Ellie met their eyes, her voice steady. "It's never too late to make things right." The mayor's face twisted in fury, but even he couldn't stop the truth from spreading. The walls of Dry Hollow were crumbling. As the room fell into chaos, Ellie could feel the weight of the moment. The truth was out, but it was far from over. The battle had just begun. The mayor turned to her, eyes wild with anger. "You'll regret this, Ellie Hayes. You'll all regret it." But Ellie wasn't afraid. The storm outside had nothing on the one brewing inside her. She had the power now. The truth had been set free, and no one could take it back. "I'm not going anywhere," Ellie said, her voice firm. "And neither are the people who've been silenced for too long." Marshall stood beside her, his hand resting on his hip. "This town belongs to the people, and we're going to make sure it stays that way." The mayor's face drained of color. He knew they were right. He couldn't stop what was coming next. The mayor's hands trembled as he looked at the gathered townsfolk, his power slipping away with each passing second. Ellie stood tall, the weight of the truth in her hands, ready to shatter the last of the lies that had held this town captive. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward, confessing their roles in the corruption. The air was thick with guilt, but it was also filled with the promise of redemption. Ellie turned to Marshall, her eyes meeting his. "This is what we've been fighting for. It's time to let the truth do its work." He nodded, his face resolute. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." The mayor's once confident stance faltered, and Ellie knew it was over. The truth had won. It was time for Dry Hollow to face its reckoning. As the dust settled, the town of Dry Hollow was forever changed. The people who had hidden behind lies for so long now had to face the consequences of their actions. The mayor was arrested, and the corrupt land deals were overturned. Ellie and Marshall stood together, watching as the town began to heal, piece by piece. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" Marshall asked, his voice soft. Ellie looked out at the town, the sun beginning to set behind the hills. "I don't know, but at least now they'll know the truth." Leah ran toward them, her laughter light as she skipped across the yard. For the first time in years, Ellie felt the weight of the past lift. The future was uncertain, but she had done what needed to be done. And for the first time, she knew she was truly free. Days passed since the town's reckoning, but the air still buzzed with change. People began to rebuild what had been torn down, and Ellie felt a new rhythm in her heart. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Marshall worked beside her, his movements more purposeful now, less burdened by the past. The ranch was quieter, but there was an energy in the air, a promise that things could be better. Leah had become Ellie's constant companion, following her everywhere. The little girl's laughter filled the once silent corners of the house, bringing a warmth that Ellie hadn't realized she missed. But even as the town began to heal, Ellie knew that the scars wouldn't disappear overnight. The truth had set them free, but the work was far from finished. She had to keep pushing forward. She owed it to herself, to June, and to the people of Dry Hollow. One morning, Ellie woke early to find Marshall already at work in the barn. She watched him from the porch, a silent figure against the rising sun. He was rebuilding the fence, just as he had promised. She joined him, picking up a hammer and nails, the familiar tasks grounding her. For the first time in years, the ranch felt like home. There was no more running, no more hiding from her past. Leah ran toward them, her small legs carrying her with surprising speed. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice full of excitement. Ellie smiled, bending down to give her a hug. "Of course you can." As they worked together, the tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate. The storm had passed, and a new day had begun, one filled with possibility. For the first time, Ellie felt at peace with herself. Weeks had passed, and Dry Hollow was slowly but surely beginning to recover. The corruption that had once poisoned the town was being dismantled piece by piece. The townspeople were taking responsibility, but it would take time to rebuild trust. Ellie spent her days teaching the local children, just as she had always dreamed. She had turned the barn loft into a makeshift classroom, where the kids learned their letters and stories. Leah sat beside her, her small hands clutching a piece of chalk as she scribbled words on the blackboard. Ellie couldn't help but smile. It was a simple life, but it was hers. Marshall helped when he could, but his heart still carried the weight of his past. Ellie understood. It would take time, but she was patient. They had both come so far. In Dry Hollow, new roots were being planted, and this time, they were meant to last. One afternoon, a group of townsfolk gathered in the town square, their faces uncertain but hopeful. Ellie stood at the center, waiting. The town's council had been reformed, and the new mayor, a former ally, had called for a meeting to discuss the future. Ellie listened as the people spoke, some still holding on to the old ways, others desperate for change. It wasn't easy for them, but the shift was undeniable. "Ellie Hayes," the mayor said, his voice steady, "you've done what many couldn't do. You brought us the truth. We owe you." Ellie stepped forward, her heart full. "No, we owe each other. It's time to move forward. Together." The crowd murmured in agreement. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As the meeting ended, Ellie walked back toward the ranch, feeling a sense of closure settling in. She had given Dry Hollow a chance to change. Now, it was up to them to make it happen. Underscore 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 underscore. Later that night, Ellie sat alone by the fire, June's journal resting in her lap. She had read through it again, her fingers tracing the words June had written before her death. The journal held so much grief, hope, and the unspoken love for a place that had betrayed her. Ellie had kept her promise to June. She had exposed the truth. Now, she would carry the memory of her friend forward. She opened a blank page in the journal and began to write. "I promised you I would make it right. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you for everything you did for me, but I will keep your memory alive, and I will make sure your daughter knows the woman you were." Ellie paused, the weight of her words sinking in. She had found redemption, and in doing so, had found peace. The next morning, Ellie stood in front of the old oak tree that had witnessed so much, the beginning and the end. Marshall joined her, his face thoughtful. "Do you think she would have been proud of us?" Ellie asked quietly, her gaze on the horizon. Marshall nodded. She'd be proud of you, Ellie. You did what no one else could do. You gave us a chance. Ellie smiled faintly. We gave each other a chance. The two stood in silence, watching as Leia played near the creek, her laughter echoing through the valley. The past had been a storm, but they had weathered it together. Now, it was time for new memories to be made. Ellie turned to Marshall. We'll be okay, won't we? He smiled, his eyes warm. We'll be more than okay. We'll rebuild, one step at a time. The following weeks brought new challenges, but also new beginnings. The people of Dry Hollow had begun working together, repairing what had been broken. Ellie felt a quiet pride watching the town transform. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Marshall handed Ellie a small, wrapped package. What's this? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Just something, he said, his smile shy. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a hand-carved pendant, shaped like a flame. Ellie's fingers traced the intricate design. It was beautiful. It's for you, Marshall said softly, to remind you that the light you brought to this place never fades. Ellie felt a lump rise in her throat. Thank you, Marshall. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. You're the one who kept it burning. Ellie placed the pendant around her neck, feeling the weight of it against her skin. The flame was hers to carry, and she would carry it proudly. Months passed, and life in Dry Hollow began to settle into a new routine. Ellie's school had grown, with more children showing up each day, eager to learn. The ranch was thriving, and Ellie had found a new rhythm to her life. Marshall had begun repairing the old fence, working alongside the other townsfolk. Leia had taken a special interest in the horses, helping Marshall whenever she could. The town was healing, but so was Ellie. She had found her place, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been a part of something greater than herself. She had done more than just uncover the truth. She had helped build a future, and that future was brighter than she had ever imagined. One afternoon, as Ellie was teaching the children, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Ellie looked up to see a man standing there, his face weathered by time, but unmistakable. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her father, the man she had thought she'd never see again. Ellie. His voice was hoarse, unsure. Ellie stood frozen, unsure of what to say. The years of silence between them felt like a wall that could never be torn down. But as he stepped forward, his eyes filled with tears, she knew that something had changed. I'm sorry, Ellie. I should have never left you, he said, his voice trembling. Ellie swallowed hard, emotions flooding her. This was the moment of healing. It's never too late, she whispered. And in that moment, everything shifted. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to write. As the years passed, Dry Hollow blossomed into a community where the truth was cherished and the past was used to build a better future. Ellie and Marshall continued to work together, side by side, creating a life that had once seemed impossible. Leia grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and the lessons Ellie had taught her. The town no longer whispered behind closed doors. It spoke with honesty, with heart, and with the understanding that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth it. Ellie stood by the oak tree once more, the wind gently brushing her hair. Marshall joined her, their hands intertwined. Do you think we've done enough? Ellie asked quietly. Marshall squeezed her hand. We've done more than enough. We've given this town a future. Ellie looked out at the horizon, a smile tugging at her lips. The flame she had carried was now the heart of Dry Hollow, and it would burn for generations to come. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.